Hey guys, welcome to Whiskey and Literature, where we read and discuss the greatest books of all time. And while we're turning those pages, we're sipping those bottles, those finely distilled spirits. I'm your host, Captain Mike, and I'm reading and reviewing 52 books in 52 weeks in 2023. This is my 15th book review of the year so far, Gulliver's Travels. And I've been super excited about this review. I've never read Gulliver's Travels. We all know kind of the story, but I hadn't read it, didn't know really much about it. I hadn't even seen the movie. And so I was looking forward to a bit of a lighter read as I've been reading some dense books. So that's one reason that I was excited about this review. And second of all, we have another little captain with us today. Stephen, welcome to Whiskey and Literature.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you guys decided to do this. Like I was telling Sadie, when I envisioned this channel, I just thought I'd be doing some book reviews, and then I added some whiskey, thought about some whiskey reviews, and then I can't remember if I was talking to Sadie first or she was to me, and we had a great idea to have her come and do the review. And I'm like, well, why not the others as well? And now we actually have Miss Laurie coming on later this year. She's doing a Virginia Woolf book with me. So I've been enjoying the book reviews with guest host.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea to have other people take part in your readings and that, because it's not as easy to share a book experience as it is sharing something like a movie experience. I feel like almost everyone is up to speed on popular movies, but it's better to actually read a book with someone than to just kind of assume that everyone knows what books are about.
Yeah, actually. So true. So true. It's like we all talk about the shows we watch on TV and we talk about movies we watch. And back in the day, it was people would talk about the books that they read. Or, if you think about things like David Copperfield and Jane Eyre and some of these other books, when they were released initially, they were released in serial format, kind of like how some of these streaming services releases a show a week. And that's how David Copperfield was released, bit by bit. Yeah. So I believe, were gifted this book for last Christmas. Is that right?
That's correct. I believe it was for Christmas. An interesting part of this is the foreword. I don't know if yours has a foreword as well, kind of an introduction to it, but talking about the David Copperfield books and how it was released, kind of like shows would be released today, and how the public had such a strong opinion about the way it ends. The foreword was interesting to this book because, it speaks about how the public was kind of offended by Jonathan Swift's satire in a lot of scenarios. And if you read the book, you can understand why a socialite in England or in educated Europe would maybe be offended by some of his humor. But I found
Absolutely.
that to be
And I
interesting.
think that was on purpose. Well, let's ask a couple questions. Like, I think of you kind of as a reader. I know with school and life and whatnot, I don't know how much reading you've been doing in the past few years, but been doing much
This
reading?
is not this is not my 15th book this year, that's for sure. This is my first book I've completed this year. I've spent maybe half a day trying to read other books. It's like you said, though, life's been a little busy, and
Yeah.
I've not prioritized reading books, unfortunately.
You're in the middle of the throes of that time in life. I can remember when I was that age, and it was crazy time. I mean, did I read? Not maybe a whole lot back then, but I was reading. So
Yeah.
if you could read, what's your what kind of genres do you like to read?
Good question. Recently I've been talking to a bunch of friends about, what recommendations we'd have for each other. And if I could read a book right now, I would actually read a finance book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I've started it before. I think the author's name is Robert Kiyosaki. I've never completed it. I love his podcasts. I'm kind of interested on his mindset. Other books that I would read for leisure would be maybe some books I've read in the past, like Peace Like a River. That was a really important book to me in high school. I think that would maybe help me get back into enjoying reading books. I find myself leaning more towards finance and maybe even political books. I would like to read Midas Touch, which might be controversial. That was co-authored by Donald Trump and Robert Kiyosaki. So being a finance related book, maybe it wouldn't be so controversial. But my desire to get into fantasy and romance nonfiction is kind of diminished lately. I find myself focused more on politics and finance and things like that, history even.
Yeah, I love it. And again, a lot of that's a product of your age and where you are in life, and it's great. And you're still, forming opinions, etc. So the whole, political stuff is what it is. You know, one of my goals in my life is to read a biography of each of the presidents, and I've read 4 or 5. So I guess I got 40 more or so to go. But,
that'll be next year's 50 books you can tackle.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I love the history of the United States, and you know, our founding fathers were amazing, and I really enjoyed some of those books. So, all right, well, let's talk about Jonathan Swift, and you started there earlier, and we'll talk about him just briefly, and then move on to the book and see how it goes. So, Jonathan Swift, he was an Anglo-Irish author, satirist, clergy, and a political pamphleteer, if that makes any sense. We'll talk about that. He was born in 1667 and he passed away in 1745. You know, he was fearful of the return of the Catholic monarchy, you know, because back then, politics and religion, England and Ireland were pretty commingled. And we have Twitter and social media and stuff like that, YouTube, I guess, to share our political thoughts and feelings. They have pamphlets. You know, I mean, that was the Twitter of the day, like what you were saying. So he was big into writing pamphlets, and they would copy these out and distribute them. You know, so you're right. Different classes of people read this book differently and took different things from it, depending on where you were on the social spectrum. And he's been described as a Whig and a Tory. If you know what those are, that's great, because I don't. And my understanding is it doesn't really correspond to any political parties of the day, but that was his bent back then, and that was his political party or whatever. But and I'm not really into that stuff. The political pamphleteering, that was a big deal back then. And you're right, this book is very political, and you can read it different ways. So let's talk about Gulliver's Travels, the specs and the stats of the book. It was first published in 1726. This is definitely one of the oldest books that I've read. I have some older ones this year, and the only one I've read that's older than this one so far, I think, is the Aeneid by Virgil. And that was written in like 50 BC or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, way back when. And Tristram Shandy actually was right about the same time as this book, I believe. Did you listen to the book on Audible or some other audio service? Did you read the book?
I read the book entirely.
I both listened to the book and I read it, and I try and read, at least if I'm listening to a whole book on Audible, I do try and read a couple chapters in it. And it is both satire and fantasy. Let's see, and some of Swift's earlier works were actually used to prosecute him. You know, he hand wrote this book, and he actually took it to a copy person who copied his manuscript, and then he took it to the printers so that if the political people could find his manuscript, they wouldn't be able to use his handwriting to try and prosecute him.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's how serious his book was when it was originally published. And of course, it was published anonymously. I thought that was kind of interesting. We've all seen, have you seen the movie with Jack Black?
I haven't, and I'd like to.
Yeah, I thought about watching it after I finished the book. I haven't seen it. So oftentimes this book is reduced to the first section when Gulliver is large. And the Liliput section, that sometimes is just cut out. It's called Bowdlerized. There was a guy named Thomas Boulder, and he took Shakespeare's works and he edited them and simplified them for the consumption of kids and women. And so that's, if it says it's Bowdlerized, it means it's simplified. And so it's often done this way and turned into a children's book or a children's movie.
Yeah,
and I assume that's what the Jack Black movie is, probably just the first section or two.
Yes, I think you're aware. I read a children's abridged version of Gulliver's Travels as a child, and reading it now, I found it interesting to recall what I remember. I only remember the first 2 adventures or travels, where the first one where he was a giant and the second one where he was small. And so I wonder if the children's abridged version you know, had abridged that much out of the book. And another side note, I've been playing kind of childish Nintendo video game recently, just kind of going back and using that to relax in the evenings. And I found there's a character in the video game where you're on an island and this character keeps washing up on shore, and his name is Gulliver's Travails or something. So kind of a play on words. That's like the first nod to Gulliver's Travels that I've seen obviously I've known about the classic for forever. Out in the world, I haven't really noticed any nods to it. I didn't even know Jack Black had done a movie for Gulliver's Travels.
Okay, and I've found that interesting as I have read books and Jane Eyre, it refers to this book. There's different, like I'll read like books and they'll refer to earlier works, and I found that interesting. And now having read them, it makes it more interesting when I come across these references. Like Don Quixote is a book that's often referenced in the classics that I'm reading, and I haven't read Don Quixote yet. It's that I'm not going to read that until December. So let's see. Major themes in the book are misogyny, misanthropy, political allusions, and individuals versus society. And I think you could read this book easily in the child's format and just read it and not really get any deeper, or you could read it as an adult and really try and pick it apart. And let's talk about the different sections of the book. As we talk about each section, then I'll give a brief summary and then we can stop and talk about that. Let's see. And I divided this into 5 sections. Most people do it into 4. So you have the 4 voyages, and then I think when he returned home at the end, I kind of count that as a 5th section. I know he returned home between each voyage, but that was just kind of a intermission or a pause, as he was getting ready for the next adventure, really. And that last return home, I think, is a whole another separate section worthy of being talked about. But the first section, Liliput, and that's where they're shipwrecked, and he washes ashore, and he wakes a prisoner of a race of people who are 6 inches tall. The Lilliputians are nice to Gulliver, but are threatened by his size. They put a great deal of weight on trivial matters, such as which end of the egg to crack. And that actually becomes the basis of a huge political rift in the kingdom. Gulliver eventually is charged with treason for, among other things, urinating on the castle, even though it was on fire, and he put the castle out, put the fire out. And he's sentenced to have his eyes put out, but he escapes to a neighboring kingdom, finds a boat, and sails home. Super brief synopsis of that first section. I mean, I can see why that would be used in the children's books and probably in the movie with Jack Black, I'm sure. So what do you think about that one?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot you could do with that, and capture the humor of being a gigantic man with this civilization that's smaller than house pets, threatened by you but interested in you. And I thought it was interesting. I thought it was familiar because I knew that part of the story, but reading the unabridged version was interesting to kind of see his take on, and this theme is highlighted in all of his adventures, but the theme of him becoming friends with this civilization, and then comparing where he's from in England and Europe to them. And I thought that theme was very interesting, probably more highlighted in the unabridged version than the children's version, because honestly it shows more about Jonathan Swift and his thoughts about England than really comparing his made-up civilization. I remember it might have been this adventure or his second adventure, but he said something about the scourge of France. And, I think modern day, you think that French people and English people are just kind of 2 similar countries. But at his time, England and France were almost mortal enemies. So he's describing the scourge of France to these people. And so it shows what he thinks of France. And just other little tidbits were kind of interesting.
I thought it was great. You have this civilization that has these rules and they're so rigid, and there's almost no, can you say it's all justice with no mercy kind of a deal, where it's just like, we have these rules, we follow them, and there's, says you got to put your eyes out. So we're just going to put your eyes out. I mean, of course, you're going to let us because that's the rules. And he's like, okay, no.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Did you have a favorite section of the 4 adventures?
I thought
if I could thrust you into one of these situations,
I would definitely rather be in his final adventure with and I'm not even going to venture to try to say it, but with the horse people. Obviously that sounded like Jonathan Swift. I feel like kind of put himself as Gulliver. He kind of made himself Gulliver. Yeah. And I feel like he enjoyed his time with the horse people the most. Certainly his time with the floating island people, and when he was a smaller person, those two adventures were probably the least enjoyable for him. And even his first adventure as a giant would be pretty unenjoyable. So, and I guess you'll talk about it, but his final adventure coming home highlights that, because all he wanted to do was go back and be with his horse civilization. And I guess you'll touch on that. So I might have given too much.
Maybe I should have asked that question at the end of the second. All right. Okay, let's call it Brobdingnag. Brobdingnag. That's the second one. And it's funny because I listened to this on Audible, so I heard, I mean, it's so complicated. That last, the horse one, it's actually just that it's a horse whinnying sound. Second time, Gulliver is abandoned by his shipmates and he's found by a farmer who he estimates to be 72 feet tall by the length of strides by his footsteps. And he's exhibited by the farmer for money and cared for by the farmer's daughter. The queen buys Gulliver from the farmer and employs the farmer's daughter to take care of Gulliver and has a traveling box built for him, basically like a small condo, and he just lives in that little box. Has some adventures. He fights giant wasps. He's carried off by a monkey, and eventually has his house carried off by eagles with him in it. That's dropped into the sea, and he is rescued. Again, brief synopsis about his time there. Yeah, I don't think that's a situation that I'd like.
No, very interesting how he tried to make it realistic, almost like if you were buying a book back then with your friends, you'd read it and you'd be like, do you really think that this guy Gulliver, do you really think his third voyage, there's mention of Japan, right? Which obviously that's a real nation. And he's sailing through real oceans and real ports and meeting.
I mean, they have maps and stuff like that. And he's talking about, the map people must be wrong because I estimate this landmass to be thousands of miles long. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, and every civilization he meets is convinced that there's no way there's another civilization out there, which would probably ring true with some people who the colonialists had met. They were all probably shocked to find colonialists coming to shore. I think that's apparent in Asian and Mesoamerican histories. But interesting, and very interesting, his second voyage and then being taken up by the eagle, and all of a sudden everything's normal sized.
He had some nice conversations, I believe, with the with Queen and the King there, and I think that's the whole point, honestly, of the whole book is when he's talking to the monarch and the people and the location.
Yes.
All right, his third voyage, his ship is attacked this time by pirates, and he's marooned until he's rescued by the flying island of Laputa. If you're a Spanish speaker, sorry about that. That's how I would pronounce that. It's a kingdom devoted to mathematics, astronomy, and music. However, they don't use any of these skills to any practical purposes. All right, so then I'm gonna have to read all this because of these names. He then goes to Balnabarbi, a country devoted to the blind pursuit of science without practical purposes. At their Grand Academy, they research such things as extracting sunbeams from cucumbers, softening marble for pillows, mixing paint by smell, and studying human excrement to uncover political conspiracies. So that's the level of experiments that they're doing. And at Lubdubdrib, he gets to visit with the ghost of historical figures such as Caesar, Homer, Aristotle, and Socrates. I thought that was pretty interesting. I mean, apparently they could call up who he wanted to talk to. If you were in a situation and you could call up the ghost of somebody in the past, who would you call up?
I found this surprising. Obviously, this was not a recollection of me from the children's abridged version. And I was shocked to find that he didn't make any mention to Christianity. And it was all philosophical people that he brought back. I thought it was kind of funny how some of the philosophers he brought back, would argue with each other, or they, hated their own works, or, things. I thought that was interesting. But he made no mention of bringing like Christ back. I figured he would make some religious mention. Personally,
how about Noah?
I mean, you could bring back Abraham. You could have the argument that Jews and Christians have had forever. Like, he made no mention of that. I found that interesting. Personally,
I assume Abraham and was a real person. Noah, was Noah a real person? I don't know. Adam, maybe if you called Adam up, would anyone even show up? I don't know.
And so maybe he did that purposefully because, you know, the whole Martin Luther stuff was going on at that time, the Church of England. You know, maybe he felt it best to not mess with those waters by throwing that into his book, the author, that is. You know, as that's a question I'd throw back at you too. I honestly don't know who I would bring back to talk to. I honestly, I would not.
If we're talking like, again, non-Christianity, I mean, if you're talking Christianity, of course, you just got to go to the source and just say, I'm bringing up Christ. And,
That's anyway, kind of the obvious answer, right?
I think so. If we're talking non-Christianity, I think George Washington was amazing. I've read John Adams' biography. I think he was a fantastic guy. You know, some of these philosophers. I think Homer. And I just read the Aeneid by Virgil. I think he would be super cool. Any one of those Roman guys. How about Attila the Hun? I mean, you know, someone like that. Yeah. I mean, just some crazy person just to say, hey, what's up?
Yeah, I mean, the tough part is language barriers too. You know, you imagine bringing someone back and remembering that they don't speak modern English.
Well, have you ever used Google Translate on your phone?
I mean, I've never tried to translate into what did Jesus Christ speak, Aramaic or something? You know, I don't quote me on that there, but you know,
all right, maybe I stick to George Washington then.
That's where I think the founding fathers would be the easiest to spend a meaningful half an hour with, or
you know, John Wesley Powell. He'd be cool. He ran the Grand Canyon back in the day, and he was one of these guys that did some crazy adventures. Anyway, we're getting far afield here, but
no,
I thought it was interesting. That's a fun thought. All right, and so after Glub Dub Drib, and he visits the ghosts and everything, he goes to Luggnagg. I thought this was really interesting too. And he encounters the immortal humans. What it would be like to live forever. And that was an interesting take on it. I was like, oh. And he thought, oh, that'd be so cool. He'd be so rich, like a vampire. You save money and you invest and you have all this real estate. And he's like, no, they're considered dead for all intents and purposes. And just they're beggars and they forget everything and just fall apart. So whatever disease they have just keeps growing.
His third voyage certainly, he takes a lot of time to rag on people like academics and mathematicians and scientists, but he also gets ragged on himself by you know, meeting these ghosts, people he, you know, they say you shouldn't meet your heroes. I guess that maybe that's kind of what he was trying to say by meeting the ghosts. And then these immortal people, I think the author nailed it on the head by depicting Gulliver as someone who would think it'd be so great to be immortal, and then having him kind of be taught life's lesson that maybe it wouldn't be. I definitely believe in that as well. Just going throughout life, meeting people who are maybe not even that old, 50s and 60s, but who've already kind of retired and have no more pursuits. I feel like people who do really well in their older age are people who still find things to be passionate about and find reasons to go out and be active.
I agree.
You know, maybe Jonathan Swift was trying to make a point. As we civilize ourselves, we don't really become as, you know, a lot of people would like to be as rich as Elon Musk, but a lot of people would only like to be that rich to be that rich. And once they had that much money, they wouldn't be trying to get to invent things or go further. You know, I think most of us in our modern civilization would be miserable by the time we reached 80, you know.
That's why I think COVID has been so devastating for our elderly population. A lot of them just shut themselves in and didn't move, didn't get outside.
Yeah.
And just, I think quite a few of the elderly recently have aged, you know, probably a decade over the COVID period, just shutting themselves into their houses. It didn't do anyone any favor. But
kind of dismal, kind of a realist perspective. So
all right, I thought that was interesting. And then from Luggnagg, so the immortal humans, he gets to Japan and meets the emperor and then goes home. Okay, and the last voyage of the voyages was, all right, I was like, am I even going to try and say this name? And
yeah, I guess you have to. You got to give it a shot.
So, like, I was thinking about like Winnie-Nims, but when I was listening, I went back and listened to it on the Audible version again, and it just sounds really just like a horse whinny. Like, so the I didn't say the Winnie-Nims. We'll just say that Winnie-Nims. So on the fourth voyage, this time he was mutinied. Like he became the ship's captain, and some people got sick, so he took on some more sailors who turned out to be pirates, and they mutinied, and they left him adrift in a canoe. And he comes across in some land, and he finds some savage, deformed humans, and then he meets a race of talking horses called the Winninums, and finds out that they are the rulers of the deformed humans, which are called the Yahoos. And Gulliver lives with the Quinninums for about 5 years, and he grows to admire them and their society, and he feels nothing but disgust for the Yahoos. The Winninums eventually feel that Gulliver is a threat and says, you have to leave. You have to either go live with the Yahoos or leave. And he's disgusted by the Yahoos. He builds a canoe with the help of one of the Quinninums and is rescued by Captain Pedro and returned to his homeland. All right, so Gulliver returns home. He had to leave or go live with the Yahoos, and Captain Pedro rescued him from the canoe. That whole situation on Captain Pedro's ship, and then when he gets back home, was super interesting. When he got home, he couldn't deal with living among a race of Yahoos, and he turns into a recluse. He doesn't leave his house, interact with his family, and he buys a couple horses and talks to them for 3 or 4 hours a day. Is that kind of how that went in a brief synopsis?
Yeah, I remember reading the 4 hours a day of talking, and I was like, man, okay. I hate to be his wife, having him gone for 5 years and coming back and being a horse whisperer. Be kind of frustrating for sure.
And that whole situation is just a sidebar, not about the story at all, really. But I mean, I think this was kind of how it was back in the day. But could you imagine just, hey, babe, here's a kiss. I might be back in a few years. We're gonna go sail in some little wooden boat around the world. And how long
Yeah.
would you wait? I don't know. I mean,
The other thing is money, like, I guess they were set up well enough to just float.
that's true. Yeah. How does she even live for those years? Again, not part of the story. I just side note. I was like, that's bizarre, but I guess it's how it worked. So, but that whole sequence with Captain Pedro and how kind he was to Gulliver, and Gulliver's just desire to just be alone. And even when he first went on the ship, it was so bizarre. I mean, he'd been for 5 years with the Quinninums, so it just totally messed with his mind and his thoughts for Yahoos in general. Just a quick side note, my aunt and cousin and mom were here in town a couple of weeks ago, and they're from Virginia. My aunt referred to, I think, the other people in the house as Yahoos. And it's just interesting now, like, okay, do you know where that word comes from? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, let me tell you.
I've definitely heard that. I never made the connection. I mean, the whole time I was thinking of yahoo.com or whatever,
Yes.
but I didn't think about that colloquialism or
Yeah. It all comes around, it's interesting. Any thoughts on that voyage home or when he got back home? I mean, he was a messed up dude pretty much.
Definitely out of character for Gulliver to be returning home in a state of, I don't know, usually he's returning home with relief or he's anxious to get home. And so I find it interesting that that's how Jonathan Swift ended his book with this, and maybe it plays to his theme of like these imaginary civilizations are so much better, some of them, than modern human civilization. Because initially, he's really bragging about Europe and England to the Lilliputians or, the first couple of civilizations he meets. And then you see him just totally ragging on the colonialists, when he's with these horse people that I don't dare to try their names. And so, maybe he's trying to make the point that he's coming home completely unpatriotically, just not even like disappointed in England, but disappointed in his race, his species. Yeah. Kind of interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that Quinninums, their society only worked because I believe they actually limited childbirth, if I remember that correctly. Like they limited how many people, if someone died, then someone else was given, they could kind of replace that, or the birth rate was such that kept their society stable, which was interesting. But yeah, definitely, I think the whole point of the book was those conversations
Oh yeah,
that Gulliver had when he is contrasting between England and Europe and modern humans in general, in some respects, and the different civilizations that he saw. And sometimes they were better, and sometimes they were worse. So let's talk about. So did you notice that each successive voyage, the cause of his misadventure or his adventures, it grew more malignant? Like the first time he was shipwrecked, and then he's abandoned, and then they're attacked by pirates, and then he's mutinied. So each time it got worse and worse and worse. Actually, going back, I had a thought a minute ago. You know what a misanthrope is? Misanthropy?
I mean, by association, maybe I'm not that learned.
It's basically the idea of you think the worst of humans,
Okay.
of people around you. Gulliver, like in the first society, he's with the Lilliputians, and he felt so superior in that first adventure or voyage. And each voyage that came along, it just kind of grew a little harder, even though he still was extolling the virtues of Europe and England to the different societies. I think he just became more self-aware of the issues and the problems until like he was total misanthropic or misanthropy by the end of the last voyage, which is why he, looked at basically all England and all humans, his fellow people, as gods.
Definitely a central theme, and I can see why a lot of people in his home country would be upset upon finishing that book.
Yeah.
Because colonialism and patriotism and nationalism was so big in Europe for centuries, So.
And believe it or not, but when he gave his manuscript to the publisher actually took out some sections and some of the worst parts of what he felt like, which I found that was pretty amazing, pretty ballsy, right? You're a publisher, this guy brings you a manuscript, and you're like, well, I don't like these parts, and I'm just going to take them out. That would seem kind of weird. But yeah, each part is kind of the reverse of the original of the prior one, right? So Gulliver's big, and then he's small, and then he feels wise, and he feels ignorant. The civilizations were complex. The first one, then it's very simple. Then it was very scientific, and then it was very natural. And Gulliver's viewpoint, it was mirrored that of his antagonist in the contrasting part. So he sees the tiny Lilliputians as being vicious and unscrupulous. Then the king of Brobding Nag sees Europe in the exact same light. Like your civilization is vicious and unscrupulous. And then Gulliver sees the Laputians as unreasonable, and then the Williams, the master, sees humanity in exactly the same way. So, each was like a contrast, and so.
Yeah, definitely a devil's advocate story for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so my thoughts on this book, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. You can read it as a kid's book. You can just kind of enjoy it and read it as kind of a funny story, and though maybe some scatological references, and even the scene where Gulliver was small and the queen or the princesses and her friends would take his clothes off and take their clothes off, and he'd be sitting on their breast naked. That whole scene where he was describing how he felt looking at the princess naked and her friends was like definitely not I'm sure that was not in the kid's story that you guys read as kids.
I don't remember that one, no.
Yeah. I wonder why. I'm sure it wasn't in there. So you could read this as an adult, and maybe you're a little bored when you read the political talk and the interplay there, or you could just go a little deeper and you can really understand, I think, what Jonathon Swift was trying to say, just basically a scathing denunciation for the state of political and human affairs in England specifically, and humanity as a whole at the time. Gulliver's Travels are just a vehicle to expose and contrast human greed, avarice, and general stupidity, I think, in all things political, religious, scientific, educational, financial, and familial. I mean, he touched on all these points in the book, I believe.
Definitely covered a broad range of topics there, and not by accident. Like you said earlier, I definitely feel like his point was to contrast civilizations and the way they function. Because I feel like he's writing and he's creating these fantasy stories, and then once he finally gets to the part where Gulliver's befriended someone and they're on an even playing field and they get to talk, I feel like those words just flowed freely, because I feel like that's the point of what he wanted to come across with. And he finally got to that point where, okay, now he's made a friend in this civilization, let's write their dialogue between each other and really let loose maybe the author's own personal thoughts about real life.
Yeah, it's basically like a hidden political pamphlet, like in large, right? Just
in a 230 page, mine's 230 pages, in a roundabout way of saying it, maybe not everyone was a colonialist at heart.
Yeah. So, okay. So, what did you think of the book overall? Are you glad you read it?
I'm glad I read it again, unabridged. Yeah, I'm glad I read it. I think it's a cool insight into popular and unpopular opinion in the 1700s.
I feel like a lot of the stuff that he said still apply. Almost 300 pages. In 3 years, in 2030, 2026, it'll be the 300th anniversary of this book.
Doesn't feel like it was really written that long ago. Obviously, the text is not modern English. If you struggle with reading books that aren't in modern speech, it might be a little thick for you. But it doesn't feel like a medieval book. Certainly isn't. But
yeah, we really didn't have any time where we were. If you think about fantasy books and like say Game of Thrones or Wheel of Time, where you're kind of in this medieval type setting, we're not really in that. We're in these fantasy worlds with these other cultures and people. So it's kind of stuff outside of time for that time period. But we're almost 300 years old. I find it fairly relevant, and still all the things he was bagging on 300 years ago are still true to today. And the political, the familial, financial, educational, scientific, I think I found it was all still relevant today. So
yeah, it's an interesting perspective for people to think that maybe it's not such a modern idea, that college isn't the end all be all, with his academic society that had no idea how to function, or all of his never ending speech about how politicians are just fighting for their own desires, whether it be greed or power. And everyone might think that these are modern problems, but they're not.
They've been around for a long time. Yeah. Well, I'm definitely glad I read this book. It's been an interesting year so far. Each book has been so different, which is what keeps me going. Each book is a little fresh, just kind of resets. It's like if you're eating the same food, which I do, I guess, kind of. But if you mix that food up, it kind of go from sweet to savory, and spicy, and then kind of bland in the background again. It's just, I feel like that's kind of the book schedule that I'm reading this year, and I'm just really glad to see this one come up. It's nice and small, light, easy read. So I'm really happy to do it. So, and I appreciate you joining with me. I'm going to give a star rating here real quick. I'm going to roll through this, and I judge all books on 5 criteria, and 6 if I listen to it on Audible. So initial response, how did I feel as soon as I finished the book? I'm going to give it a 4. I felt pretty great. It was a very fun read, light and easy. It was nice. Recommendation, how likely am I to recommend this book? I'm going to give it a 4 as well. I think, I know a lot of people who wouldn't want to read this book, but I think the readers that I know would enjoy this book. Style, did I enjoy the writing style? Also a 4. Why not? Nice and linear, easy to read. Plot and structure, how engaged was I in the story? And I enjoyed it. I think the plot was kind of fun, how he did everything. I'm going to give it a 5. The characters, relatable, believable, and engaging. Whatever, I give it a 5 as well. I thought they were all awesome and great. Whether they're believable, whatever. I get a 5 for characters. Audible. Now I listened to an Audible. I believe the author or the narrator was David Hyde Pierce. He was on the Fraser Show for you old people. I'm only going to give him a 3. I felt like it was okay. It's just okay. And that's 25. And 25 divided by 6 is 4.16. So 4.16 stars for Gulliver's Travels by Jonathon Swift. All right, Stephen. Thanks for joining with me today. I'm so glad you could be here.
Glad to be here myself. It was a good time.
And you're coming up again here. I'm trying to see how many books here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more books to read, and then I'm going to the Heart of Darkness, and you'll be reviewing the Heart of Darkness with me as well.
I'd better get started right now. If it took you 15 books to get to this and it took me that long, I'd better get started on Heart of Darkness as we speak.
You know, I tried to read Heart of Darkness. I know we had 2 copies, and you did this in high school, and you annotated it, and it's almost the same length as Gulliver's Travels, 200 and just over 200 pages. So
I guess I've read the unabridged version before, so maybe it'll be easier for me to dissect, but I do remember it being rather thick.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, literally, I tried to read it like twice, and I don't know how far I got into it. I don't know if this marker is where I stopped at. If it is, I got a total of 32 pages into it.
It's on the list for a reason. They made us read it in high school for a reason. I guess we'll rediscover why, because I can't remember.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited about it. Hey, side note, did you read To Kill a Mockingbird in high school?
I did not. We had an alternate, and I couldn't tell you what that was, but
You know, I thought I had read it, and I know we're talking about the Gulliver's Travels right now, but I just wonder if you had read that, because we had the book. So maybe
Sadie, someone else might have.
Yeah. Dude, I just finished that one, and it was a fantastic book. I mean, I really, really enjoyed that book. All right, guys. Thanks for sticking with me. Links to my other book reviews are in the description below. If you enjoy the content, like it, it's free. And see the description for my other book reviews, and subscribe if you want to see more of my comments. I hope you're reading something good and drinking something great. Turn those pages, my friends, and stay thirsty. Cheers.
Cue the music.